Hello, everyone. I'm Alexander Beadle, science writer and editor with Technology Networks. I'm joined here today by Dr. Arlene Blum, founder and executive director of the Green Science Policy Institute, to discuss their latest study published in Nature Sustainability. The study, a collaboration between researchers in the United States, Canada, and China, demonstrated that some polymers commonly used as non-toxic flame retardants can break down into more harmful chemicals as they degrade. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Bloom.
Delighted to be with you.
Can you tell us more about where and how these supposedly non-toxic brominated polymers are currently being used?
Well, that's actually a hard question because so much is called confidential business information and it's very hard to find out. But we certainly have uh, a lot of evidence that they're used in electronics heavily um, and quite possibly in other products.
And why have these polymers come under scrutiny now?
Well, polymers are big molecules, and it's long been believed that these big molecules can't get inside people or ecosystems and cause harm. But in actuality, you have to look at the whole life cycle of these molecules. And unfortunately, when they're being produced, they're small molecules that are harmful. And when they're used, often they're leftover small molecules from the production, or they can break down into small molecules that are harmful. And then at end of life, they can degrade into small molecules that are harmful. And the real problem is that the small molecules are subject to a lot of testing and regulation and have to go through lots of hoops to get used. But polymers do not have regulation either in the EU or the US, and I suspect in the UK also, similar to the EU. So it's a loophole. And the producers of flame retardants have increasingly stopped making the monomers, which are regulated, and stuck together a lot of the monomers to make a big polymer and say it's fine. And we think it's really important that the polymers also have to have scrutiny and regulation before they're used.
And this study specifically also found several of those breakdown products from these polymers in soil and dust samples taken from locations close to electronic waste recycling facilities, like you've said.
And the further you went from the facility, the lower the level. And the molecules that were found, really the Chinese authors did all the hard work on this. I proposed the idea to Da Chen, the first author. We had lunch in 2018, and I said, everybody's studying the monomers, the single molecules, because they're easy to study, but they're not being used hardly at all anymore. What's being used are the polymers, and hardly anyone's studying them. Do you think you would be willing to? And he actually didn't answer, didn't say anything to me for 5 years, during which time he worked really hard with his postdocs and students, and they came up with a very innovative technique for identifying and looking at the many breakdown products of the polymers, and found named 76 different breakdown products. It's really an amazing piece of work because first he developed this really difficult analytic technique, calls it BR minor, to identify all these brominated fragments. And then, as you said, he looked outside electronic recycling locations and discovered the very fragments were there at the highest levels, closest to the sites. And then he did toxicology, looking in zebrafish, and discovered that the fragments were harmful. So it's really a pretty complete case that polymers do break down, can be harmful, and to my mind, should be regulated.
And I should also just add that the toxicity testing that you mentioned, the study specifically found significant potential for causing mitochondrial dysfunction, developmental and cardiovascular harms as well. So there are some potential serious implications here.
And An interest of mine, which isn't in the paper and the press release, but your listeners might find interesting, is I've worked for a very long time on what are called halogenated chemicals, where you have carbon connected to bromine, chlorine, or fluorine. And all the ones that have been studied have been found to be harmful because those sorts of molecules don't occur naturally in any mammalian systems. And so our cells don't know how to deal with them. And there are papers. There's one very good paper in ES&T that likens, it sort of tells a great analogy of nightclub bouncers that keep drunks and misbehaving people out of nightclubs. Well, the things that keep noxious chemicals out of cells don't see organohalogens. So these brominated molecules aren't seen by the things that protect us, and also the things that toss things out of cells, those factors don't see them either. So they tend to go into our cells and just stay there and eventually cause trouble. And when they're studied, all these fragments do cause one kind of trouble or another. So I mean, I do believe at a higher level that one should only use these brominated, chlorinated, fluorinated molecules when there's a real need and a real major proof of benefit, and that's not the only way. And I guess PFAS, of course, which is very well known now, is a very similar example that we really shouldn't use these unless we really need them.
I'm interested in also, you mentioned the sort of regulatory loophole that exists with these compounds, which the study talks about as well. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on this slightly, or if you have even suggestions for how this loophole could be improved based on the paper.
Well, both in the US and in the EU, polymers are not regulated. They're given a free pass. So to maybe a little exaggerated, but you create a toxic molecule and you'd have to do all kinds of regulatory things. You probably couldn't get it registered, say, under REACH in the EU or approved in the US by the EPA. But if you take that toxic molecule and you stick together a whole bunch of them into a polymer, a big molecule, then there's no regulation. And that's true in Europe and the US. And there are efforts, certainly in the EU and in the US also, to consider starting to regulate polymers. And there are, particularly with PFAS, there have been a number of papers showing that PFAS polymers do give off monomers that are harmful. And I think this is the second study that showed that with brominated flame retardants. So you need a body of science, but I think this paper is unique that it went beyond just showing the breakdown to showing it in the environment and then showing the toxicity of the breakdown products. So